Well, hi, everyone. My name is Kendall Valentine, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington, and I'm a coastal ecogeomorphologist. So a lot of what I do looks to couple biological, chemical, geological, and physical processes to understand coastline change. And so today I'm going to talk to you about using exploratory models to be able to understand coupled geomorphic and carbon processes. Now, some of you in the room might not be familiar with what on earth is an exploratory model. So exploratory models basically use idealized situations, so idealized basins or transects, and we can test a variety of processes against them. So these are some great examples of showing how we can recreate different delta processes, marsh migration or ponding, basically trying to identify which processes are the most important to create the landscapes we observe. If you need more, there's a great Brad Murray paper that I cite here on the bottom. And so I went in to try to develop a coastal transect model that would look at the entire coastal system and how it changes over time to be able to test how sea level rise might drive changes in this ecosystem. And so briefly, I'm going to present, this is the COLT model, the Coastal Landscape Transect Model, which is publicly available on the CSDMS model repository. But briefly, what it does is it couples basic geomorphic processes like edge erosion of the marsh. So we have wind and wave energy going on here, the vertical accretion and decomposition of sediments on the marsh, and then the march of the marsh upwards into coastal forest dependent on sea level rise and slope. So these are the basic geomorphology. And I coupled this with some carbon processes. So I have the erosion of the marsh edge releasing carbon, which then can be recycled. What I ended up showing is that recycling turns out to be quite important. We have the vertical carbon accumulation, which depends on the plants actually deposit organic matter with depth, depending on their root structure. And as well as I track allochthonous and autochthonous carbon within the system. And then I also develop forest carbon dynamics that I'm not going to talk about today. And so what does this model look like? So this is just an example of output. So the top panel is elevation over this transect. So you can see Bay Marsh Forest. And each I'm plotting every 10 years. And so you can see that we have with sea level rise, accumulation in the bay, and the marsh migrates landward. And then we can track where we see autochthonous carbon. So marsh plants are really productive in the interior, where allochthonous carbon coming from the bay is highest near the marsh edge. And so we can start to answer really interesting questions in this type of model framework because we can test under a range of different conditions. And so what I'm going to show you is how this marsh does and the carbon when we look at sea level rise rates from 1 to 15 millimeters per year. And so on the x-axis, we have sea level rise, and on the left y-axis, we have carbon accumulation rate. And so I'm showing you the total and then separating it out by autochthonous and allochthonous carbon. And then on the right y-axis, I have marsh width. And what I really want you to see from here is that we have synchronous peaks in the vegetated marsh width and the total carbon accumulation, and this happens at an intermediate rate of sea level rise. This ties in nicely with what Tracy showed yesterday, where Ellen Herbert had a nice paper that showed this kind of increase in carbon accumulation. So we're saying that, oh, we can increase carbon with rising sea level, but eventually we hit a tipping point where we are storing less and less carbon. Another thing I noticed from these model runs is that the allochthonous carbon was actually really important. And this is something we don't normally take into account in blue carbon estimates. If we look at this in a different way, so we're actually tracking that allochthonous and autochthonous carbon with every soil cohort. So this is showing a 500-year model run, which, by the way, can run on your local machine in 30 minutes. And so here we can see under low sea level rise conditions, this is the marsh that accumulated in the last 100 years. And you can see that this is demonstrating allochthonous carbon where it's highest near the marsh edge. But if you increase sea level rise rates, you get a ton more of that allochthonous material coming from the bay. And so we're recreating the processes that we see to be able to test these conditions. And so what was really cool to me is this whole idea that allochthonous carbon might be very important and an underappreciated aspect of our coastal resilience. And what I could do in the model that I can't do in real life is I can turn off the deposition of allochthonous carbon. So that's exactly what I did. So on the left is what you've seen before. And so on the right-hand side, I have on the x-axis sea level rise and then carbon accumulation in blue, marsh width in red. And I just turned off allochthonous carbon. And what we see is that we still see the same trends. We still see a peak, a synchronous peak between carbon accumulation and marsh width. but it happens at lower rates of sea level rise. So we have this tipping point happening earlier, and we have less total carbon in the system. And so this indicates that the presence of a loxinous carbon is really important to marsh resilience, and it's something we don't think about enough. And so, and then we see that shift to the left, sorry. And so that is kind of where this model started. And so since that time, I've been adding a lot of fun things into this model. And this is where I wanted to bring to this group to show what's up and coming and how you could maybe help work with me to develop new ideas. And so my first thing was, well, let's add some biology. So if you know anything about me, I love biofilms or benthic biology that lives on the surface. So one of the first things I did was figure out how can I put this lovely mat of cyanobacteria and diatoms into this to understand sediment transport? So I developed a module to be able to do that. And what we see is that it breaks off the connectivity between the marsh and the mudflat, leading to rapid deposition in the mudflat. And what's really interesting is this leads to rapid carbon accumulation because this mud here actually contains quite a bit of carbon. So even though it's a loxinous material, so not typically used in carbon accounting, it can be very important. Interestingly enough, we also get a decrease in the marsh elevation just by a touch with the presence of biofilm because of that break in connectivity. Other fun things that I'm currently implementing, so I had this yesterday because everyone was talking about crabs. Well, I'm actually modeling burrowing shrimp. So these are in Willapa Bay, Washington, and they really destabilize the sediment. And so I'm figuring out how to quantify their effect on sediment transport and develop a module for this model to understand these guys. It's really crazy. It's 100% sand, and when you step on it, you sink up to here. So they are clearly changing the sediment dynamics, but we never capture that in our model. Does it matter? That's what I'm trying to see in this exploratory model. Another thing that I'm trying to work on in collaboration with Maddie Foster Martinez is understanding how different plant root structures might affect this. So you know that we have plants, different species might have plant roots that are kind of in the top of the soil column or ones that go deeper. Does it matter? You should talk to Kendall Valentine, my graduate student who is working on this right now. And so those are kind of some of the biological aspects that I've been incorporating into this model framework. And then, well, I've also thought about what about restoration? So this is work by a PhD student I co-advise at VIMS, Mary Brian Barksdale. So what we did was we developed shoreline stabilization module and thin layer placement into this model and be able to see how carbon moves. And what we find is that basically with sea level rise, you switch optimal restoration strategies. So in the short term, marsh sills or shoreline stabilizers are more important, whereas later with accelerating sea level rise, the presence of thin layer placement helps a lot more. So really excited to talk about this more. I guess I have a second. So I will go into this. So in this here, the pink dashed line is the volumetric elevation capital. So basically how much marsh volume is above the mean sea level. And so the no restoration case is this red dashed line over time. And what we can see is that the green line is when we put a sill in or a shoreline stabilizer. That is the most effective measure up until we kind of hit an inflection point in this. And that's when thin layer placement becomes more important. You'll notice the little zigzags up because we have thin layer placement happening every 10 years. And so we worked a lot with the Army Corps to understand how the thin layer placement actually works to be able to do this. And so this really underlines the importance of vertical versus horizontal stability in marshes because the sill really is more a horizontal component, whereas thin layer placement is more that vertical. And so that's why I'd really like to push this idea of volumetric elevation capital. Mary Brian Barksdale has done a good job showing that that shows a more collective representation of marsh resilience. So where do we need help? What we really need help with is understanding the chemistry. So I've put in some very crude, rude estimations of carbon about how it decomposes as it's eroded from the marsh edge. And so why I'm here today is to learn how we can do better at these carbon processes since we're tracking them at such a fine scale. So I will leave you with my take-home messages is that exploratory models are really powerful. You can run them on your own machine. And if you want to use Colt, it's open access and available to you. So thank you.